My topic focuses on the affinity argument, which supports the soul's immortality. This is done in Phaedo by Plato. In Plato's Phaedo, Socrates provides his affinity argument wherein he claims that there are two kinds of existences, the invisible and visible. Socrates states that the soul is invisible whereas the body is visible. Furthermore, he declares that the invisible soul is godly-like, immortal, and easy to understand, while the visible body is human, mortal, and incomprehensible. The invisible soul is unchanging and remains the same. The visible body is constantly changing due to the body influences that may distract us. Socrates explains that the divine soul is to rule and to lead, whereas the mortal body is to be ruled. So therefore, the soul rules the body and the body is ruled by the soul. The main question raised is, what are the differences between the invisible and visible realms Socrates claims in Plato's Phaedo in his affinity argument? My answer 1 comes from Plato's Affinity Argument for the Immortality of the Soul, written by David Apolloni in 1996. Apolloni considers the affinity argument as a weak claim made by Plato and not Socrates. Apolloni argues that although the soul may not be a physical object like the body, it should not be perceived as being incomposite. He claims that since it is possible to disperse the soul, then the soul is not immortal and therefore it can be dispersed. However, the soul cannot be dispersed in the same as the body, which is a physical and tangible object. Apolloni has his arguments based on the idea that the soul is invisible while the body is visible. He argues that while the body continually undergoes change, the invisible nature of the soul ensures that it remains constant. However, the two are interconnected in that it is through the body that the soul is able to perceive. Moreover, the author believes that the invisible nature of the soul can also be attributed to its divine nature. Apolloni states that the body is dragged by our bodily senses while the soul wanders coming into contact with such things. The soul is more like the always the same rather than the never the same, which is the body. The soul rules the body when inside and is more like the divine than the body, which is more like the mortal. My answer 2 comes from The Role of the Affinity Argument in the Phaedo, written by Matthew Elton in 1997. Elton provides a different opinion of the affinity argument, whereby he holds that the soul is entirely indissoluble. The author claims that Plato was not in agreement with the view, based on the analogical forms. Moreover, he explains that the soul should not be considered immortal, mainly because the soul ceases to exist. Elton has his claims based on the analogical arguments made by Cebes and Simmias. The analogy of the tuning of the lyre is given, whereby the attunement is the immortal aspect while the lyre is the mortal part. It is claimed that if the strings of the lyre were to break, it would be expected that the lyre ceases to exist, while the attunement remains. However, this is never the case because the attunement is no longer there while the lyre remains visible. This kind of thinking should not be encouraged when comparing the invisible and visible natures of the soul and its relation to the body. Elton views Socrates' views of the visible and the invisible realms as an appeal to the emotions of Simmias and Cebes. That is, it is not a rational philosophical argument, mostly because it lacks proof. Rather than considering Socrates' argument as accurate, Elton uses the Phaedo to show how Socrates' theory is an example of the making of mistakes in philosophy. My own novel contribution. The soul and body are different, wherein the soul is powerful. The soul is godly-like and rules the body, whereas the body is ruled by the soul. The body is distracted by the bodily senses and therefore cannot recognize truth, while the soul can through mind and reason. The body will die in the distant future, but the soul will remain. I personally agree with answer number 1 that the body is constantly changing due to its senses, and that the invisible nature of the soul makes sure that the soul never changes. Support for novel contribution. These two quotes come from the Phaedo. The first quote explains and supports my view of how the bodily influences are a distraction, and so that the soul is dragged by the body through the mistakes done by our senses. The second quote explains that the body is indeed ruled by the soul. Since the body's nature is to be ruled and be subject, it must give in to what is asked of them. The body being ruled influences its actions and serves as a distraction from what the soul wants.